Good day. My name is Dolphijn. I'm associate professor at Utrecht University. I'm very honored to be part of this wonderful conference, and I'm very sorry that I cannot be there in person. Thanks to Irene for inviting me to this wonderful panel, Humanities Facing the Challenges of the Climate Crisis. And I will now take my 15 minutes to say something about what I call waves, to recognize the rhythms of the land and the sea. So this is an overview of what I've done over the past years, some of my books. Been very much interested in ecology and in material culture. I have a background in philosophy and in art theory. A new book on fascism is actually coming out, which I edited together with Rose Berdotti in 1 month, actually. But this talk will be mainly linked to my work, The Philosophy of Matter, which is the last monograph that I published, which you also see on this page. So my talk will consist of 3 parts. This is the first part: to float, to think, and to live. And I want to start a bit by talking about the Dutch situation. So how do we imagine the sea? That is actually how I would like to begin my meditation. A very important publication by Hugo de Groot, in 1609 was the book The Free Sea, which is still used actually as kind of the backbone of so many writings on what the sea is and what the sea means for us. It's a very short book. It was written while he was still quite young, actually, 21, I think. And most important idea in this book, The Free Sea, is that the sea itself cannot be possessed. So this was a big discussion in the time. The Portuguese were starting to kind of colonialize Asia, and Hugo Grotius also, of course, from a nationalist perspective, because the Dutch were also interested in colonializing things. But still, I mean, this book has become quite important, therefore, also in terms of land rights, saying that the sea is something different than the land. The sea is always in movement. He talks about the fish and the sand are fluid and ever changing, and therefore cannot be possessed. So the sea cannot be considered property, in contrary to the land, which is property, which is part of the nation state back then already. So this different approach towards the sea has been quite leading in the discussions that have happened since then on what the sea is and how do we deal with the sea. Another book that I would like to introduce here to start my thinking is actually a series of books, is actually the work of Sigmund Freud, who, this is a photo of him in the Netherlands, in The Hague, actually. He visited the Netherlands 3 times because he was interested in how we dealt with the water, in the relationship that the Dutch had with the water. Coming from Vienna, going to the Netherlands, it was quite obvious for him that there was a very interesting and perhaps different way of dealing with water, or a quite obvious way, which meant mainly that the Dutch tried to control the power of the water very obviously. So Freud rented boats and then he paddled through the canals, through the countryside, noticing how the Dutch were very active in kind of finding ways to build dikes and to see how the water can be controlled, because the water was very much seen as a dangerous force. So he was there actually when the biggest it was actually a sea in the middle of the Netherlands, which was already turned into a lake by building a dike on top, actually. the Zuiderzee it was called. And then in the 1920s, 1930s, the Dutch started to build new land in that sea. And Freud was there, he was very much impressed, but then he also thought this is very much actually how the modern mind deals with the sea, meaning that what was the way in which the human being tried to control the sea was very much in relation to how it tried to control itself. And then coming to his own vocabulary, trying to control the id. So these unknown forces that are inside of all of us, sexual forces, libidinal forces, that do not have a voice, but that kind of speak through the ego, and that are trying that the superego tries to control. So for Freud, the whole idea of controlling the it was central to the modern mind. Actually, this whole division of thinking in terms of the it, the ego, and the superego actually came from what he witnessed in the Netherlands and how the sea and the water needed to be controlled. So this kind of fear for the sea, this fear for the otherness and for the movement of the sea, throughout the two books, but actually in the Western mind, I would say it's very much kind of a history of controlling the outsider, controlling the unknown forces that are somehow considered a danger for us. I think it's crucial for understanding also, and maybe especially even today's ecological crises and the way we have dealt with these issues in the past. So if we look at a big project which is now run at Utrecht University, the drowning deltas, it's obvious that building dikes and kind of keeping the sea out and considering the sea a danger causes actually the sinking of the land, and the fact that with the rise of the sea levels, countries like the Netherlands are in serious trouble. I mean, I'm recording this from Rotterdam, the city where I live. I live in a house built in 1896, but we live below the sea level. In fact, we live 7 meters below the sea level. So if we keep on sinking, and if the dikes are not if something is not done to change the course of things, then we are in trouble. Anyway, this is something that I guess nowadays in the humanities has been questioned more and more. Our relation to the sea, our relation to the environment, to nature, to the world around us. And I think it's really important to see how in thought we see this shift taking place, and we see also how other ways of thinking become more prominent. So a thinker that is very dear to me and that recently passed away, by the way, that has been practicing a very different relation to nature, different relation to the water around us, is Michel Serres. Michel Serres wrote a lot also about the Garonne River. He grew up next to the Garonne River, and throughout his writings, think of The Natural Contract or Biogaia, you see that he always practices a very different relationship to the water and to the sea, always stressing that the Garonne River, having grown up next to it, is part of himself. And he said that the troubles of the Garonne River, it was drying up already at the end of the 20th century when he was starting to write about this. The drying up of the Garonne River is actually the same thing as himself kind of losing the capacity to work with his body, to live the life that he wants to live. So for him, it was hugely important to see that there this very kind of inclusive relationship, this strong entanglement with the water, and his thinking. I will come up with some other examples later on. I think it's also good to look at the arts and to see how in the arts we are now trying to find ways to relate to the sea and to the water differently. So I have one artwork which I find really inspiring, which was at the Venice Architectural Biennial 2 years ago. Project by MIT, where the sea is not so much seen as the dangerous and the dangerous outsider in movement, but much more as something to work with. So you see that they are now trying to see how waves. This is also how I got my title of this talk. How the waves are kind of creating the difference between the land and the sea. In the top corner of this slide, you see a bit of sand, and they created a kind of a spiral in it, spiral wave, and then slowly, of course, you see how an island kind of comes together from the sand and how it differentiates from the sea. So the creation of the land and the sea are consequential to the wave is actually what this project is all about. And to show this and to make use of that in practical situations, they created these huge cushions, which they placed in the ocean on very particular points, making use of how the waves were going, and then kind of building artificial islands, and not by putting a lot of energy in it, not by using sand from one location, putting it in other locations, but by just making use of the currents and of the way in which the sea works, and thereby kind of finding ways to deal with the current ecological crises, and finding ways to kind of rebuild the islands that are in growing danger nowadays. So I thought this was a really nice artistic project, of course, kind of very much connected to the sciences, and very much kind of in search for thinking the sea differently. So, as said, I think this is also how in literature, this also shows how in literature people are slowly trying to create a different relationship to the sea and to what happens in the sea. So whereas with Grotius and with Sigmund Freud, you still see that whatever comes from the water is considered a danger and something you don't engage with. But nowadays there are so many scientists, especially that make a much more interesting study of the sea and actually come up with very important elementary questions on how to rethink our relationship to what lives in the sea and how we deal with the sea. So a few of the things that I want to light out. First, a discussion in a field called animal architecture, where they look at, for instance, this Difulia coronata, which is a tiny amoeba. Very interesting analysis by Mike Hansel, where he asks us, how is it possible that a one-celled creature is able to create such a complex shell? And you see here an image of, as said, this is the house of a one-celled creature with very beautiful spikes at the end and a very detailed mouth. So how is it possible that a creature with no brain is able to create this? Of course, this is a very humanist discussion and very much kind of shows how we, over the past 2 centuries, have been thinking about ourselves and have refused to look at what happens in the sea, have refused to study other forms of being that perhaps work with a very different way of knowing than ourselves. So I think, and especially looking at the discussion that followed this publication in Animal Architecture, you see that people are now starting to question more and more whether there are other forms of life, other forms of thinking that we used to kind of push away, that we didn't think of before, and that And nowadays, also because we're just confronted with nature more and more, we're confronted with the diversity of nature, with the power of nature in these crises, that we just have to think of, and what are these other forms of thinking, and how can we kind of learn from that. So another example in neurobiology is a discussion that was held in the journal Nature, well known, of course, about the Kuozoa. You see here a picture of this creature, which is a very fierce hunter, a deadly hunter also. But as you can see also, it has no brain. There are perhaps 4 neural nodes, but not a brain as we hope to see brains, but still it has very complex behavior. So how can it think like that? How can we rethink the idea of thinking by looking at creatures like these, looking at also the amoeba that I just talked of, and to see how we can kind of explore nature better than we did before. So I think that's also a very interesting example here, the box jellyfish or the Kuozoa. So the last example I want to give is a more recent publication by a philosopher / biologist, Peter Godfrey Smith. It's called Other Minds, where he's really trying to learn from the deep sea and learn how especially the octopus has developed parallel to ourselves, but actually in a very interesting and complex way. So looking at how the octopus is able to think differently from us is also, I mean, I advise you all to read this book and to see how consciousness can also be thought in a much more ecological way. So not just as something which happens only in the human brain, but also which happens in territories, and especially in the sea, where you can see very different forms of thought at work. So I think the work of Brian Masumi in this sense is a very good way to conclude the kind of the otherness and the otherness of the sea, and the ways in which we nowadays are trying to open ourselves up to this otherness. So not by closing ourselves up and by thinking only from a humanist perspective, as we saw that actually with the works of Hugo Grotius and Sigmund Freud, but to really understand how different forms of being, different ecologies matter, and how these different ecologies are at work around us. I think it's the only way actually to deal with the climate crisis and to deal with the surprises that will kind of follow shortly, and that will change our world again and again. So therefore, these lines from Masumi are always very kind of inspirational to me. And that truth is not out there. Truth is always in the making. Truth is not simply what we observe. It's also because of our image of the human being and the animal, or because of our image of the sea and the land, that we work way too often with very fixed ideas of how things are and how things work. And especially if truth comes knocking at the door, for instance, in the current climate crisis, we need to revitalize our ideas about this. We need to kind of look at the sea and look at what lives in the sea and look at its possibilities anew. So therefore, this last sentence is also very powerful. I think the emergent activity of relation has given place to the stable relativity of disjunct gestalt results. So I want to finalize this talk by just giving another example of how powerful and how strange and how unexpected the sea is, and by just looking at this most recent form of being. And it's the newest layer of sediment. It's called plastiglomerate or plasticoglomerate. In 2006, it was discovered in Hawaii. It's actually this will be the new layer of the Earth, very much constructed by us. As you can see on this photo, you see pieces of rope and a button in it. So this is what the sea produces at this moment. In 2006, it was found in Hawaii, as said, but nowadays this is found all over the world. So it's quite important and in the end also kind of influential way of the way things are changing. So anyway, this is what I wanted to share with you today. I hope to be able to get more of this conference, to follow other talks, and thank you for your attention. And I hope we can somehow follow up this conversation somehow.